The International Financial Reporting Standard that was issued by the International Accounting Standards Board in May of 2017 and known as IFRS-17 has an expected effective date of January 1st, 2023. And while IFRS-17 was welcomed by many insurers, questions remain as to what will happen when it comes into force. I'm John Weber for AM Best TV, and I'm speaking today with Anthony Silverman, Associate Director of Criteria Research and Analytics for AM Best. And Tony, can you give us a brief overview of IFRS 17?
Thank you. Well, it's an accounting standard, as you said, promulgated by the IASB, and it changes the accounting for insurance contracts. And it applies to IFRS reporters, so it doesn't apply to insurers reporting under US GAAP, it doesn't apply to US reporters, it doesn't apply to most Japanese reporters, insurers, sorry. And if an insurer reports exclusively under local GAAP, it won't apply to them, but substantially it means it applies to virtually all large insurers outside the US and Japan. And there are three things about it which sort of characterize the standard. And one of them is that reserves are all discounted for the time value of money. Secondly, there's an explicit allowance for risk in the reserves that's reported as the risk adjustment. So we get away from the hidden prudential margins in existing reporting. And the third thing is that for long-term, typically life insurance contracts, the likely profit over the whole term of the policy is assessed and is deliberately fed into profit in an even way over the terms of those policies, instead of emerging as just the release of some expanded prudential margins, however they would fall out. And that expected profit, as well as the amount that's fed into profit each year, is visible under IFRS 17. It's reported as a liability until it's fed into profit, and it's called the contractual service margin, the CSM. And this expected profit data on it is maintained by sales cohorts, by annual sales cohorts. So you can see the contribution that's fed into profit from each year's sales. And the final thing that I would mention about IFRS 17 is that it's going to be applied to insurers across all territories. So it's, in general, IFRS 17 will be more transparent, I'm afraid more complex to report and to use, but also more uniform across and consistent across all territories.
And AM Best just published a commentary about IFRS 17. Can you tell us about that, Tony?
Well, yes, John. IFRS 17, as you mentioned, was published in May 2017 after a lengthy period of lead-up of consultations and exposure drafts. And as you also mentioned, in fact, as a reaction to a lot of the comment after that standard was published, the IASB then published in June 2019 a further exposure draft, which effectively reopened the existing published standard for limited amendments. And the note is a commentary on the IASB's decisions around those amendments and what the resulting changes are. Perhaps the most obvious one, the most obvious amendment is the effective date of the standard, which was January 2021 in the standard as published. The exposure draft proposed 1st of January 2022, and the IASB's decision was that the effective date will be 1st of January 2023. And the decision was all about the substantial changes required to implement IFRS 17, the timetables for that, and the attractiveness of having the standard adopted and implemented at the same time as widely as possible. I'll mention three of the changes just to go through it. So that's one. A second one, another very notable change, was the implementation, this time basically as in the exposure draft, of a proposal to amortize a part of acquisition costs over policies that have yet to be written, but which are expected to be written, for example, renewals. But this is a new departure, we certainly see it as that, for insurance accounting. It does parallel practice in other sectors in which is incorporated into IFRS 15, under which bidding and other costs can be capitalized for contracts that you expect to materialize in the near term. So that though this quantity will be called deferred acquisition costs or DAC, it's about amortizing over policies that are yet to be written, and it's really not the same as the DAC that preparers and users will be familiar with already. But we'll continue to use that data as a means to an end to target the underlying economics, and we'll continue to do that with this new data. And finally, there's one other example of an amendment that was proposed that I would mention, and in this case it was something that was not in the ED, in the exposure draft at all, but was proposed by several insurers anyway, and it was tabled for that reason. And this was just a proposal to remove, for certain policies, and most participating life policies particularly, the requirement to maintain that data by annual cohort. And if this proposal had been accepted, it would have removed the ability to compare the profitability delivered by each year's sales for some of the largest blocks of business in the European life companies, actually. But the proposal was rejected in this case by the IASB because of the usefulness of the data for users of accounting data. And that's despite what was the points that were made around the difficulties of implementation for some insurers. So that's probably the end of that proposal, but actually it's still possible that some insurers will try to influence the political process around the adoption of IFRS 17 in Europe. So it may not be, it's possible it's not the end of that proposal. So, that's just some of the things. There's a lot to write about in the note. But in general, all the proposals have implications for our collection and use of accounting data in AM Best, and we'll be evolving our processes, very much aware of these decisions, to optimize our use of the new data in 2023 and beyond.
Now, could IFRS 17 have any impact on an insurer's rating, Tony?
Well, that's a good question. As I've mentioned, we use accounting data to target the underlying economics, and that target remains unchanged. So we don't expect any near-term impact on ratings from the new standard, even when it comes into effect in itself, although there might be second-order behavioural consequences over the slightly longer term. But what I will say is we do expect the annual cohort data to be of considerable interest in the life sector to all external financial stakeholders of life companies. It may even help life insurers justify writing participating business, which is something they've struggled to justify, perhaps to external stakeholders. So whilst we might, if I can say, be taking a more picturesque route in the life segment, it will be a different route for the industry as a whole. It will be a different route to the same destination with no expected changes to ratings in the near term.
Do you think insurers are properly prepared to implement the new standard?
Oh, we're closely in touch with our rated companies on this sort of thing. And I would say there is some variation in preparedness, and we'll be keeping closely in touch over the coming months and years. But in general, yes, insurers have had a long while to prepare, and in general, the work has been done or is planned, and we expect to be receiving the new data in 3 years' time or so.
Thanks, Tony. That was Tony Silverman, Associate Director of Criteria Research and Analytics for AM Best. You can find the full report online at ambest.com. And I'm John Weber for AM Best TV.